going to talk about empathy, and usually we think about empathy as something virtuous, something good. What is really good about us humans is that we have the capacity to empathize with others, yeah? And when the world goes to hell, we often rely on this capacity. We tell ourselves that although there's a lot of injustice, a lot of violence in the world, we still have the capacity to empathize with others, and therefore we also have some hope. And if you're going to bring home a message today, it will be that this is not really the case, I'm afraid. Empathy does have a dark side. It's not only about virtuous behavior, it's also about trickery, of manipulation, of violence, and it's not only a question of crossing differences between people, it's also about maintaining differences. And not only that, but our main argument, and I think that will be probably the most important thing for you to bring home, is that this dark side of empathy is in fact a necessity for sociality as such to thrive. In other words, we wouldn't be social beings, have relations with one another, if the dark side of empathy was not there.
So the dark side of empathy, we argue, is not so much dark as social. And in that sense, exploring empathy is for us a way of exploring what sociality is. Closer. Exploring what sociality is. And this, what you were just doing, is the good side of empathy. This is the kind of empathy that is about imagining yourself in my shoes, sensing my embarrassment up here, and trying to help me. That is what we usually associate with empathy, namely the ability to put ourselves into the lives of another person, feel with that person, and do something to help that person. We're arguing that this ability, what the German philosopher Theodor Lipps called Einfühlung, the way of feeling your way into somebody else, is actually a basic human capacity that humans share with other animals, a lot of animals in fact, and that this ability can be used for various things, one of which is to help me, like you just did, but another, and we will give you a couple of examples, is to deceive or trick somebody. And the first thing you have to do, but go back on, because the first thing you have to do is we argue that a lot of people think that empathy, feeling yourself into, to take the perspective of somebody else, is the same as sympathy, to feel compassion towards somebody. And the two get inflated all the time and have in fact been inflated for, we are saying, like 400 years of philosophical history. Maybe that's a big mouthful, but we're saying that the tendency is to impute or to associate empathy, the ability to put yourself in somebody's shoes, with a moral good, the willingness to want to the other person something good. But we're saying that it makes sense actually to dissociate those two and to take the moral argument later and to study the basic human and mammalian capacity to take the perspective of another individual and study that in and of itself. And then we can talk about morality later. So buckle up, have a drink, and start dissociating sympathy from empathy.
I think it's important again to return to what role empathy really plays in the place of empathy in our world as human beings. We as human beings are social beings, yeah, and we tend to think about sociality and empathy as a capacity to bridge gaps, to understand others, and this these positive sides is what links sociality together. But in actual fact, and we will give a couple of examples in just a minute, sociality is based on a type of deception. It's based on a type of lie. And when I talk about a type of lie, it's because it's a lie that we, in a way, acknowledge already. I think it will be evident when we give our examples. It's a kind, we acknowledge that, you know, our society is run by lies, but it's a type of lie that cannot easily be exposed, because if these lies are exposed, our sociality, our relationships with one another will fall apart. And this capacity for lying, if you would like, and use empathy as a way to create a web of lies is something that is also found in the animal world.
An example of the way we lie in everyday life would be gift giving. And this is well described in anthropology and also by the French philosopher Pierre Bourdieu. He talks about what he calls pious hypocrisy. So, for instance, if I give you a gift, Rane, I know that Rane knows that I know that I expect something back from him. I cannot tell Rane that. The worst thing you can do when you give a gift is to say, and I want one back soon. Because that destroys the relationship that the gift is meant to build up. We both know what the gift does, but none of us can articulate it. So this is an example of the way that sociality builds on rules that we cannot expose. Exposing them would be to take away their efficacy. And sociality, we argue, is run through with these kinds of mechanics. What other examples could be love relationships. Maybe you should tell that, Rane, you're better at that. What makes somebody fall in love with you? What do you have to do?
The thing is, when you think about it, yeah, you're sitting in a bar and you're trying to seduce the girl next to you. What is it that what are you in fact doing? Well, I mean, if you are working as an anthropologist, certainly you wouldn't start talking about anthropology, because that would be a dead end, yeah? Instead, what you try to do is you try to figure out what is her interest, yeah? And not only do you mirror and imitate that interest, well, you actually create an ideal world around it, yeah? So she get a sense of what she could become if she was merging with you, yeah? And then you have it, yeah? If you actually succeed in creating this ideal image of her, reflecting back to her an ideal image of her and what she could become if she joined you, then you have seduced her. And you use empathy, yeah? You use the human faculty for empathy in that act of seduction, because you need to place yourself in her shoes, so to speak. You need to imagine the world from her perspective in order to manipulate it. And that is really what our cases will show. And I think maybe we should just go to the case studies, no? Or do you have a point?
I want to say something about animals first. Because love affairs and gift giving are just two examples. Think about what we call tactical empathy. It was on the board just earlier. Think about police profilers, those people who look for serial killers, like CSI people. What you have to do as a police profiler in order to imagine yourself what it is like to be a serial killer in order to catch him is what we call tactical empathy. You don't want to become a serial killer, I assume. You know, you want to catch the guy, but you do it by placing yourselves in his, most serial killers are men, I think, in his shoes, and imagine the world as he would imagine it. And then you try to emulate it. So method acting does the same thing. It is the way of projecting yourself into a world that does not necessarily want the good of the person you're trying to be as an actor, but you're trying to put yourself in that position. We're saying that sociality is shot through with the kinds of empathy that do not necessarily want the good of the person whose life you're stepping into, but want, for some other reason, perhaps to catch them, perhaps to seduce them, perhaps to trick them, con artists, for instance, to do something else to them. And that's what we call tactical empathy. And tactical empathy, we're suggesting, is something that humans that we have evolved to a very high degree and is basic to what our sociality is about. But it is not something that we are alone in having. And let's have the apes now and the animals now. No, not that one. Because it is the last 10 or 20 years of research in etiology of animal behavior have shown that animals actually lead incredibly rich emotional lives that are in many ways comparable to those of humans, and that they have a great repertoire of empathy. A lot of it is about this, about hugging, about consoling, about bonding, about picking lice from each other's skins as a way of calming each other down. It is what we usually associate with empathy. But there is another aspect, and we think the more interesting aspect of this empathy that is related to what we call tactical empathy, namely those studies that look at, for instance, what could be called the everyday politics of great ape societies. Studies have, for instance, shown that chimpanzees, if a low-ranking chimpanzee who has been given food and been able to hide it is then approached by a higher-ranking chimpanzee, that chimpanzee that has hidden the food will purposely not look in the direction of the hidden food because, so one assumes, it knows that the other chimp will then know that something is in here. So for me to purposely look away from the banana over here so that this guy will not discover it is actually a way, in order to think up that strategy, I have to put myself in his shoes and imagine that I know that if I look here, he will know that there is something of interest over here. So this already entails, this little action already entails what scientists call a theory of mind, that I have to have a theory of what it is like to be in the head of Rane. And that chimpanzees have this. Other studies have shown, for instance, that low-ranking male chimpanzees will, with their hand, I will try to do it, will cover, if they have an erect penis, will cover the penis so that the high-ranking male will not see it, but the females will see it. See? So that takes a double perspective. You have to put yourself, what is it like to be a female and see a female chimp and see an erect penis, and what is it like to be a high-ranking male and see my erect penis? He will get upset, I know this. But I'm hoping perhaps that somebody else will be excited. And that is the game of sociality that we're trying to get at, that there are these little games that all mammals play that are premised on what we call the empathic faculty, but that are not about the moral good. I want to copulate. I do not want his good, I am stepping into his perspective in order to cheat him. And this is what we're interested in.
Right. Okay, let's move up the food chain a little bit, from chimpanzees to human beings. I mean, we have, Nils and I, as anthropologists, are specialized in various regions of the world, and we deal with very different kinds of people in a very different kinds of setting. But we found out by comparing our data that perhaps we have found something of a universal nature here. But let us just give some case examples. I'm specialized in a group of hunter-gatherers in Siberia called the Yukagir. They live of hunting, and they have strong social relationships with animals and spirits. This is the area far away from from Western civilization, and these people they hunt moose, but like other indigenous peoples around the world, they ascribe to a cosmology which is called animism, or in fact perspectivism, which implies that every creature in this world, moose, other animals, even inanimate objects, will see themselves as human beings, but will see everyone else as either predator and prey. And everything depends on the kind of body you have on. So in this kind of world, it has a lot to do with taking on bodies of other species. And we see this in Amazonia here, someone dressed up as a jaguar, and this person will then be able to see the jaguars as they see themselves, namely as human beings. From Africa, we find the same principle, Northwest Coast Indians, and also among the Yukagir that I'm studying. The whole point is that that this world is based on the idea that animals have to be sexually seduced to give themselves up to the hunter. So hunting is really an erotic play where the hunter travels to the spirit world in the nighttime, seduces the spirit sexually, and the next day the moose will, which is the kind of counterpart, if you would like, the doppelganger of the spirit, will be so sexually excited that it will throw itself at the hunter, and in a sexual desire to get a sort of a sexual climax, the hunter will shoot it in the head, and the spirit will realize that what it thought to be like a really sexual exciting game turned out to be a murder, yeah, and it will start attacking the hunter. He will actually become the prey. The point is that the whole universe here is built on a kind of lie, acknowledged by everybody. It's a lie which implies that that you can only talk about hunting as love. You will never hear the Yukagir talk about hunting in terms of violence, in terms of predation, and so forth. But everyone knows, of course, from experience, that hunting means blood, means violence. And they also know that, the antithesis of love is predation. But you can't expose that fact. And there is, so the whole point is that you kind of use your empathetic capacity to seduce the moose, yeah, and kill it. And everyone knows that this is going on, no one can expose it. Then there is this one myth, which stands out among all the Yukagir myths, about a young girl who looks into the eyes of a moose killed by her brother, and she thinks to herself, oh, you must have suffered when my brother killed you. And at that very moment, all luck in the hunting group ends, and people starve. And they find out about the girl and her thoughts, and they have to kill her. They kill her, and after they have killed her, luck comes back. So the whole point is, of course, that she is exposing the obvious, yeah, the thing that everyone knows. The spirit knows it too. They know that they will die, that the moose will die. They're just so narcissistic that they really want the thrive of the hunter's desire, and therefore they throw themselves at the hunter day after day, yeah. But the moment this game of lies is exposed, the whole cosmology collapses, and the girl has to die in order to keep the lie going.
I promised to break you here, Rane, because I was to remind you here that what the girl actually does, the reason why she has to be killed, is that she's feeling sympathy towards the moose, right? She feels sorry for the moose, and thereby exposing the lie that one cannot, feel sorry for the moose. One has to keep up the pretense that it is not about killing, it is about loving. And that this relationship is actually what we're trying to give to you, that there is a cardinal sin, a deadly sin of mixing up sympathy and empathy. What the hunters want to do is to insist on empathy in that tactical sense that we're talking about, and what the girl mistakenly does is to feel sympathy, feel compassion towards the moose, and that is what is the big no-no in Yukagir society, right?
Absolutely. Let's go to the next case. Absolutely, let's go to the next case.
Oh? Oh, okay. I want to take you to Indonesia, a wholly different place. Instead of a place of land and ice, it is a land of tropical forests and water. It is a place that has an incredibly long colonial history, because in particular the place that I put a little ring around here, North Maluku, which is a predominantly Muslim society ruled by sultanates who in the 12th century became Muslim, and in the centuries afterwards controlled the trade in spices, in particular nutmeg and cloves, and this gave them a great deal of richness. Almost at the same time as the sultans became Muslim, the Portuguese arrived and brought Christianity, and later on the Dutch, and converted about 20% of the population to Christianity. So you have a society that is mixed Muslim and Christian, but it is a distinction that is not normally ideologically emphasized. This is the son of my sister. she's a Christian, he's a Christian, but I don't know if you can see the Saddam Hussein t-shirt, just to show you that this is ordinarily not a society that places a great deal of emphasis on the difference between what it means to be Muslim and what it means to be Christian. This all changed in 1999 when Christians and Muslims started fighting with each other in a savage kind of fight that emerged out of islands further south, and that very much was a type of conflict that increasingly turned on whether you were Muslim or Christian. Military was sent in, the military started selling their guns to the people in the conflict, it got more violent, eventually, the whole area was destroyed, 10,000 people were killed, and about a third of the population were driven into displacement. Because of the violence in central Indonesia, around Jakarta and the main island of Java, Muslims started to feel that they had to help their Muslim brethren, and this led to the radicalization of some Muslim groups that ended in the Bali bombs of 2002. So I just want to say that although those islands are quite remote, they're tied into a national and even global history of Muslim-Christian antagonism. The violence over there in North Maluku in 1999 began with this letter, and this is where we get to empathy. This letter was a fake letter. It was a forgery, but it claimed that it was a letter sent by the Christian church to all the church members, instructing them to go out and kill as many Muslims as they could in as sadistic a way as they could. What is interesting about the letter is that it was shot through with Christian rhetoric. It was written as if it was a minister who had written it, with all of the language that a minister uses, with all of the millenarian expectation. This was 1999, and if you remember, if you were born then, maybe you were, I think you were. In 1999, a lot of people thought that in 2000 things were going to happen. Planes would crash, etc. In Indonesia, there was a great sense, especially amongst Christians, but also amongst Muslims, that the world was going to end. And the letter was kind of, imbued with this sense that the world was ending, and that before the end of the world, a great conflict had to happen, and that somehow the year 2000 would be the year where the good and the bad were separated from each other. So the letter was a very good kind of diagnostic piece of document that showed the kind of mentality of 1999. It was also a forgery that was written in likelihood by Muslims. So what you have is a letter that pretends to be Christian, writes in the language of Christians, is set up as if it was like a public official document, and had everything that those documents had, but nevertheless was written by somebody who was not Christian. Now, this is the first paradox of this letter that has to do with empathy, namely, I keep wondering, what does it take to cultivate empathy with somebody that you hate? Cultivate enough empathy to put yourself in that person's position, emulate or mimic that person's language, that person's idea that the world is going to end, and write with such compassion that it translates into a credible document. And this is what happened. Because of this letter, conflicts broke out throughout this region over here, but similar letters were written throughout Indonesia, all of them fake letters, all of them pretending to be written by somebody else. So what we're having here, I think, is a political type of document that is all about tactical empathy, in which you put yourself in the position of the other that you hate in order to demonize him and essentially kill him. And what is interesting about this, do you want to say something, Rane?
Well, I think it's important to emphasize that what the two cases share, is that people know it's a lie. People know that this letter that was forged is a lie, but they act upon it anyway. In the same way that the Yukagir hunters know that they are hunting, when they talk about hunting as a love relationship, as a sexual relationship, they know it's a lie, but they act upon it anyway. And in both cases, you can say that the entire society, the entire cosmos, rests upon this particular lie. So the real puzzle is, why is it that people go along living according to lies? And why is I think we have established that you can use your empathetic faculty to maneuver and manipulate people, but it is exposed as a lie. I mean, it is a lie, but people go along with it anyways. That's one of the big puzzles, yeah?
Is it Zizek or is it Tausig, I forget, you probably know, calls this dissimulation, when you believe in, or you pretend to believe in something in which you do not believe. Remember the gift from before? That is a type of dissimulation. I pretend that I don't know what the gift is about. For if I reveal it, the social efficacy of the gift will be lost. So I have to dissimulate. I have to pretend I do not know. Similarly, we are saying that this is a basic kind of social type of dynamic or mechanism that has to do, that plays upon and is enabled by the empathic faculty, and that this is something that we can diagnose in both of our cases, where the empathic faculty is used in a tactical way, not to commune or understand or empathize, no, wrong word, sympathize, but in order to tactically get an advantage. And we've been struggling with this, why this is, and we're kind of saying that this is related to a particular universal. We're anthropologists, we don't usually say universal, but now we do. We want to say that this is a universal mammalian faculty hardwired into us. It is the basic capacity that allows us to be social. Maybe it is the reason why we can be social in the first place, but that in every case it is associated with a particular kind of cosmology or sociology. Rane's animals and the killing of moose and the problems of how to dissociate and empathize but not sympathize with the moose was associated with what he called perspectivism and the ontology of animism. In Indonesia, it is a political ontology where in this period in the 1990s, there was a sense that all power was fake, that one could not trust anything. And what is interesting about this case is that this letter convinced people, not because it was a good representation of Christians, because it wasn't. It was a poor representation. A lot of people that I talked to who were part of that violence said that when they saw the letter, they knew it was a fake. So the paradox is, why do you partake violently in something on the basis of something you do not believe? That is the paradox. And the paradox, I think, is resolved in the political ontology, in which every aspect of Indonesian society and state politics was untrustworthy, but it was still believable. And it is this relationship between believability and untrustworthiness that we're talking about, what we call dissimulation before.
And then both of us have started getting really interested in Neanderthals. I mean, it's not something that social anthropologists usually deal with, but we are fascinated by this idea that at a certain point in human history, two types of sapiens lived side by side, yeah? Homo sapiens sapiens and the Neanderthals that died out about 40,000 years ago. And they had successfully survived the Arctic climates of Europe for thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of years. But the moment humans enter the scene, quite quickly the Neanderthal dies out. And it's a puzzle why. And the question really is whether empathy could provide a key to understanding this, because the moment Homo sapiens sapiens, that is us, enter Europe, there's an explosion, not only in technology, in Stone Age technology, but also in image making. And you have probably heard about the famous caves of Lascaux, 30 to 40,000 years old, of huge animals being depicted, and also this guy here called the dancing sorcerer. And there's very little doubt that these depictions were used as a hunting magic, because there are spear marks on the images. And the question really is, hunting magic, isn't that empathetic magic? It's a type of magic whereby you project yourself into the animal, you imitate it physically, and through that imitation, you actually take control over the animal. There's a sense in which, you as a copy is more powerful than the original itself, namely the animal. And the question really is whether the Neanderthals had that capacity for deceptive, for strategic empathy, for tactical empathy, to enact, so to speak, the dark side of empathy, or whether these people, the Neanderthals, were really entrapped in sympathetic relations. We know that they had emotions towards each other. Well, there are quite clear evidence of that, flowers into graves and so forth. But apparently they didn't have the capacity to create images, to create technology that is based really on the capacity to step into someone else's shoes, in this case animals, and while still keeping a distance, so to speak. And the question is whether, was it really the dark side of empathy that annihilated the Neanderthal? The thing is that by looking through the lens of empathy, and if it holds true that they were incapable of empathizing or using the tactical aspect of empathy, then their sociality would have been of a different kind. It would have been less complex. That's why they died out.
Well, I think there's something interesting going on. Our cases are about whether empathy is related to the origin of sociality, and that's why we keep talking about the Neanderthals. There is something interesting about Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens, in the last 30,000 years, it is the only time in human history, in the last 2 million years, that we have been the only human species on Earth. For all of the period before that, 2 million years minus 30,000 years, which is not a lot, there have been several human species, often living side by side in East Africa, or in this case in Europe. What is interesting is that within a couple of thousand of years of humans getting the ability to think symbolically, or at least that is what the evidence, to draw paintings on walls, the Neanderthals die out. The last competing human species dies out. I think that is worth pondering. Is there a connection between the ability to think symbolically, and what does that mean? That means thinking in terms of, say, identity, of there is an us and there is a them, of difference, and of the kind of tactical empathy in which we're interested, of making that a distinction of knowing who I am by putting myself in the shoes of somebody who then becomes another. What we're actually arguing is that there is no other and self before empathy. Empathy is the capacity that makes it possible to think of oneself and of the other in the first place. If that is the case, then is there an association, a link between that high level of tactical empathy that we're talking about here, namely identity making, and the extinction of the Neanderthals? I think that a lot of theories have gone away from that they were hunted down. There's much to suggest that it was actually a genetic kind of watering out of them. It doesn't matter, but I think there is something interesting going on here.
I think we'll end on that note.